My opinion is university education is not supposed to be so narrow that it only revolves around job market skills. I don't think that was ever the point.
Assalamu alaikum, Umar. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Walaikum assalam. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Umar, we want to get to know you a bit better. So, could you introduce yourself to me, but also to the audience?
My name is Muhammad Umar Boodoo. I am an associate professor in management at Warwick Business School in the University of Warwick, which is in the United Kingdom.
Very good. You have studied mathematics, economics before. Now you're an associate professor, so you're at the other side of things. Could you tell us what was the journey from going from one side to the other?
It's quite a long journey. Let me begin perhaps by talking about the bigger journey as well, which is, I was born and raised in Mauritius, so near Madagascar, Indian Ocean. And in Mauritius, we generally follow a similar schooling structure to the UK, culminating in A levels. At the end of those A levels, I was able to go to Canada and study economics and mathematics at York University, thanks to a scholarship that I was able to get. That lasted 4 years, and then I started a PhD in finance. In that PhD, I didn't do very well, and quite frankly, I wasn't much invested in the field either. So then I started a different PhD in industrial relations and human resources at the University of Toronto itself. Towards the end of that PhD, I started a research and teaching fellow job at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. While doing that job, I finished the PhD and then I started a job at Warwick Business School as an assistant professor. And following a probation period, which is quite typical in an academic career, I was then promoted very recently to the position of associate professor. So that's been the journey, I suppose.
This has been quite a journey. Can you tell us, for instance, from the PhD in finance, if it's not too personal, what was the things that you thought maybe you did not resonate with the most? And then how did you decide maybe HR was more of an aspiration for you?
So, I mean, there's two reasons, quite frankly. The first reason is I didn't do too well myself in some of the subjects. The mathematics, in some of the courses that I was doing, I don't think I did very well in them. The other thing that also drew me away was that it was all about asset pricing, corporate governance, and so on. And I didn't felt quite the connection with what I aspired to do. And I think therefore there was also a little bit of a lack of motivation on my end, which is something I'm not very proud of, but it's something that happened in my life. And then pivoting from that field to doing industrial relations and HR, that was far more because I was interested in the societal aspects of management, of what I wanted to do, some certain public policy implications, and I think that was closer to how I viewed myself. And interestingly, I think this view of myself was shared to me by my friends before I realized myself that I was interested in these kinds of topics. So sometimes it's very good to have friends who are able to tell you how they perceive you rather than, you finding out yourself over time who you are and what you're interested in.
I love this, and I love the fact that you're so honest straight away. All of us have done mistakes, have failed certain things. It's not a straight line, and nobody has a straight line. Some people may be the exception, but it's just fine to have a diverse background. I think it's actually a strength in your career afterwards. A lot of people that are listening are the youth, and some of them apply for scholarships. You were in Mauritius before. How hard was it to get a scholarship? And what advice maybe you can give to the youth who are targeting scholarships for their future?
I'm not sure how hard it was because that would be a question probably to the people on the panel who were deciding who would get the scholarship. What I do remember is I was, I think, one of three from Mauritius who got the scholarship. One of them didn't take it because she wanted to do a degree in medicine, and the scholarship wouldn't pay for that for, I suppose, a variety of reasons. But also in North America, medical school begins after the first undergraduate degree, so that wouldn't have worked anyway. Somebody else got it, and I too, who flew from Mauritius, and that's the way it happened. So the advice I would give is listen to your parents because I was never going to apply to that scholarship because it was Canada. It was in French, also most of the degree anyway, and I was absolutely not interested in leaving tropical paradise of Mauritius and going to that polar bear land up north. But my dad said, just apply, whatever. If you get it, you get it, but you don't have to take it. So I applied, I got it. And thank God I got it because I didn't receive anything else that was in the northern, global north or the Western Hemisphere, if you will. So I think listening to advice, maybe something that youth, at least I was young back then anyway, more of the youth should probably do.
And Omar, you're only the second guest that I have from Canada. The first one was actually a young guy who's called Mohammed Ryan. He's from Pakistan. He was the youngest developer. He works at Microsoft now in Vancouver. I'm so proud of him. He's so young. He was a software engineer by the age of 14 years old. And the second one worked in Canada. So I just want to know from the stereotypes you had in mind, coming from Mauritius, going to Canada and then living there for a long time, how did it maybe break your stereotypes, or how did you appreciate your living there? What did you think about Canada at the end?
I mean, Canada in the end, I think it's a big country and there's obviously variations in people and climate because it's so vast. People probably don't understand if you haven't been and if you haven't lived and met people. I was 18 years old at that point, and I don't think I had stereotypes about Canada. What I was surprised by was the size of it. Even the roads, like one of the biggest highways in Toronto has like 16 lanes or something, which is like absolutely massive, coming from a tiny island of Mauritius. And even now in the UK, we don't have anything, as far as I know, that's 16 lanes wide. So I think that's one of the things. And then the other thing that surprised me was the snow. I still remember in my first year, I think I had to pick up groceries or something. I was getting some food. Took a bus from campus to whatever I needed to pick up, and snow was up to my knee. And I remember walking, and that was hard, and it was cold. When the wind is blasting against your face in particular, that's quite hard. But I don't think I had any, stereotypes or anything like this about
Of
Canada.
course. So for people who are unfamiliar with Mauritius, go on Google Images, type Mauritius, see what are the landscapes, and then type winter in Toronto. And then I will invite you to realize. Coming back to the studies, what inspired you to pursue a PhD? Because a lot of people, especially in Canada, I think most people, correct me if I'm wrong, they stop at bachelor degree. In Europe, it's mostly at master degree. I talk about Europe excluding the UK. So what inspired you to go above bachelor degree, above master degree until PhD? What was your objective?
The attraction of a PhD was at least twofold for me, or maybe three. The first is the lifestyle. I believe academics, and I knew that because I saw academics as I was going in university, obviously. Academics tend to have quite a flexible schedule. It does get quite manic, at particular points in time. Like right now, for example, I have a lot of marking to do, but generally speaking, there's an incredible amount of flexibility in the job. I also think, whoever your employer is, they make the correct and good assumption that the academic employee is working on delivering some goals, right? They may be research goals, teaching, that you'll do your job. You're not just, you know, lying and doing nothing. So that's the first reason, the flexibility part of it. The second is the ability of an academic to research and work on what you're passionate about, what drives you. What impact do you want to make in research, practice, and teaching? So you have a lot of control, if you will, over what you're spending your time doing. So control over time, not just the lifestyle and the flexibility of it, but actually what you're doing with the time that you're actually working. The third, and this may probably answer your question about any kind of return on investment, whether this is a career that produces some kind of return on investment, is that I believe that a career in academia provides a more than comfortable income at the end of the month. I remember at the time I was studying in Canada and I wanted to remain in Canada. And generally speaking, the academic salaries in Canada and North America in general tend to be much higher than the salaries in the UK or Europe or the rest of the world. With a few exceptions, of course, there's always the exceptions. So I think for me, money was not the main driving factor in choosing a career. As a matter of fact, I would say if money is a driving factor or one of the prime factors in choosing a career, then this is probably not the right one. But if the idea is to have a more wholesome lifestyle, a flexible lifestyle, control over your time in particular and what you do with your time, then I would say it's probably one of the better jobs out there. I still remember when I was finishing my undergraduate, I wanted to actually have a career in finance. At that particular point in time, I was like, I'm going to do the CFA. I'm going to become an investment banker or somebody like that with a career in finance. And one of my professors invited me to his office, and he was a French guy, and he said to me, you know, Monsieur Boudou, I don't think this is a good career option for you. And I'm like, oh, okay, why would that be? He's like, and if his question, are you Muslim? And I'm like, yes, but he's like, are you practicing? I'm like, oh, generally, I think so. And he said, then I'm not sure you should do this because I think there is a massive drinking culture and a different kind of vibe that is there. And I think if you're somebody like that, you might find it very difficult to gel and to find yourself in there. In fairness, I think at that point in time, we're talking 2008, I think he was making very good points. Maybe today the landscape in finance has changed a lot because there's a lot of fintech and Islamic finance and everything. I think things have changed massively, but that was the advice he gave me, and at that point anyway, it sounded like very sound advice. So
There is a huge introspection that you have done going from finance to another field. I wanted to know more also about the affordability of the studies. For instance, in Europe, a large part of your studies is basically financed by the government. In France, everybody does postgraduate studies. In the US, it's not the case. Here, everybody gets a shot to even like the top schools. Can you tell us, for instance, in Warwick, in the schools where you have been an assistant or an associate professor, if you see the diversity in terms of social equality? Do you see people coming from deprived areas who get a shot to those prestigious business schools like Warwick, for instance?
So I'll answer your question in several parts here. One is at the undergraduate level. The UK government has a program. I don't think it's as generous as the programs in France and other European countries, but there is a program called Widening Participation, where, as the name suggests, the idea is to widen, get a bigger spectrum of people coming into university. So these would be, for example, first generation university goers, right? So parents, grandparents never went to university. The UK government really wants to attract people to come to university. So at Warwick Business School, we've got our own kind of branded version of this UK widening program. Now, it's not a lot of money, but it helps a lot. For example, it helps perhaps you don't have to do a job because it helps you with a little bit of a stipend. Plus, on top of that, we also do events for these students who get this scholarship. So the underrepresented students, if you will, we can call them that, who get these scholarships at undergraduate level. Then at master's level, to my knowledge anyway, nothing is funded as far as I know. Maybe a few here and there, but to my knowledge, the funding there would be far more limited. Again, that goes because in the UK it's not expected that somebody does a master's, whereas an undergraduate degree is quite common for you to be able to get up on the social and economic ladder. When it comes to doing a PhD, I don't know about other schools, but certainly in the bigger schools, and Warwick Business School would be considered one of them, hopefully, they tend to be fully funded. So you don't have to pay fees, number one, plus you get a stipend, and you can live a decent life. Not comfortable life, but decent enough.
I loved how you phrased things to answer the question. You mentioned the research side of things that I think was the driving force for you to go and pursue a PhD. Research, I can see it's a passion project for you. You know, you have made a research on sustainable development, but also income inequality. We just mentioned this topic. What are some of the insights you discovered in the course of this research? And maybe you can enlighten us on this topic.
Right. Maybe let me begin by sharing what these things are because maybe some people might not know what I'm talking about. So, the United Nations had developed a 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And with that, there was a list of 17 sustainable development goals, so the so-called SDGs. These include lofty goals to achieve hopefully by 2030, such as no poverty, zero hunger, decent work and economic growth, reduce inequalities, and then there's a bevy of things related to climate change and justice. And as you've said in your question, I have tended to focus much more on the inequality aspect. I'm also delving now into the poverty aspect, but that's something new which I can talk about later. So, just to give you an example, one of the projects I did and which has been published as open access. Open access, again, for the non academic, it means anybody can access it without having to pay a fee to the journal or the publisher or whatever. So it's open access, it's out there. If you Google me, you should be able to find it. So that's a paper on corporate philanthropy and health inequalities. So corporate philanthropy is basically, at least in a US context, when generally big companies set up a corporate foundation, which is itself like a charitable trust, and that corporate foundation then gives money to charities for certain societal projects, right? So you could give money, against domestic violence, you could give money to reduce poverty, etc., etc. So the particular paper we were looking at is on corporate philanthropy and health inequalities. So one would think that a philanthropist, especially a corporate philanthropist, would dole out money in such a way that the neediest people in society would benefit from that money. In American English, we could say that such a strategy of identifying the neediest and helping them would result in the biggest bang for your buck. In British English, we would probably say, you want to achieve greater societal impact. Rather than finding this in our findings, what we find is that corporate philanthropy gets directed not necessarily to the neediest communities, but rather to communities that are known to the corporate foundation. So, for example, in our case, it was communities and hospitals that are closer to the corporation, are urban, that do not have the highest need for doctors, and that are not the unhealthiest. They were the ones getting more money than those communities that actually needed them the more. So that was already kind of a bit of a problematic finding, because all of a sudden corporate philanthropy, one would think that it should go to the neediest, but it really wasn't. And there was some anecdotal evidence as well, especially during COVID, that this was actually happening. So it's not far from what the newspapers and stuff were also reporting case by case. Now, in our work, it was far more widespread. We were looking at the general trends. And again, we've got to be very careful here. The kinds of analyses that an academic does, especially if it's quantitative and wants to be representative of the general trend in society, is that the analysis we do give you this general picture of what is happening on average. Of course, one would think that there are certain philanthropic, the particular philanthropic organization, maybe there is one that is very critical and analytical and impact focused in terms of how they spend their money. But our work, and there's been more work since then and also before, does show that more work is needed in order to get corporate philanthropy, and perhaps, the other term which is often used is corporate social responsibility, or ESG as we call them today, to be far more socially or societally impactful. I don't think the evidence is there yet to demonstrate that these actions are for the benefit of society, or are targeted to really benefit society in a meaningful way.
Also, I think there's still skepticism, especially in the US, for instance, where Donald Trump has been elected, but he's going to refrain on climate. But also, I see that initiatives like DEI, where they're trying to give people a chance who come from minorities, colored people, people from diverse backgrounds, they're trying to give them a chance. But now, some companies, for instance, in the US, are trying to scale back on DEI initiatives. I was reading a post on LinkedIn where people were saying it was not even sincere in the first place. So the public opinion is then mixed about corporate philanthropy, because they feel that it's at the end a bit of marketing, because otherwise we wouldn't see the phenomenon of some companies scaling back. This wouldn't even be possible. So what do you think is the future for this field? And how sincere you think is corporate philanthropy at the end, because it's still business?
Right. I think these are very interesting and very good questions. I think, in my experience anyway, anytime you reduce positive action into a box ticking exercise, so whether that's in terms of disclosure, so you have to disclose what policies you have on DEI or what policies you have on ESG and what not have you, The moment you start doing that, it becomes a box ticking exercise. I think you're really lowering the standards of what you get. I like the saying, there's no smoke without fire. All this backlash against ESG, corporate philanthropy, there is foundation behind these arguments, right? They're not coming just out of nothing, out of thin air. But I think in general, nevertheless, this is like picking the bad apples and only focusing on the bad apples. I think there's a lot of good that's happening with ESG and CSR in general. It's just, I think a bit more work is needed to make sure that we can identify how these things actually benefit society in a positive way. And I don't think much work has been done yet on that. There's many academics that are really interested in doing this kind of work, and I think I would consider myself to be one of them. But it's really, really hard to identify exactly how this is happening or whether this is happening or not, just because of the measurement issues. When you get into academics, you start discovering that measuring things like this is actually much more difficult, and especially measuring causal stuff. So, can you measure whether an ESG policy by a company has caused a positive societal impact? That's an incredibly difficult question to actually empirically answer. But many people are working on these things, and I hope I can be one of them. And I encourage other people also to actually work on these issues, because these are really the hot topics of the day. We're talking today in December 2024. I don't know what the hot topics will be in the future, but at least for today, this is one of the hot topics as far as I'm aware, anyway.
You know what I would love? I would love for presidential debates or very key political debates to have someone like you from the research side of things to say this is true, this is false. Have you got actual statistics to back this up, etc.? Because they're all false promises. And sometimes they said we have done this or that, while we realize by listening to you that a lot of statistics go behind it. You must do a lot of research to just say one thing has actually caused the other thing. So I think it's very interesting. You mentioned the UN objective for 2030. The UN estimates that closing the global income inequality gap could increase global GDP by $100 trillion by 2030. I think, of course, closing the global inequality gap is a bit of a utopia. But I don't know what is your thinking about the fact that without the corporate world, because we see that even big companies like Meta, Google, Amazon, these are almost countries in a sense. They are so powerful. So I don't see how, without the implication and maybe the obligation of certain companies to get involved more on this, we can get a better society. It's a bit of a philosophical question. What do you think on this? What do you think of the role companies should play? Should we obligate them in a certain way? Or do you think it should be up to them?
One of the interesting things that I've heard very recently, so there's somebody by the name of Milton Friedman, a Chicago economist. So Chicago is known to be a very libertarian school of thought, free market and laissez-faire economy and everything, low government intervention. He came up with an article a long time ago, and he said the social responsibility of business is to make profits. In other words, he was one of those proponents who did not believe in other stuff like the ESG stuff of today and everything. And there's, to the opposite end of that, there's the other scholars who come and say, no, the social responsibility of business is much more than that. So we should be doing far more for society and whatnot have you. But I've heard something very recently, and I think I tend to agree with that. The social responsibility of business, in my view, should be to pay your fair share of taxes. Because if you pay your fair share of taxes and that goes to government, I think that would enable governments, so hopefully those governments that are serious and want to do real work, to alleviate, like you said, income inequalities, to create infrastructure in these countries, so on and so forth. The problem is we don't live in a world where there is no arbitrage, right? So if one government starts taxing these big companies, as you said, the big companies are countries in and of themselves. So if one country starts taxing, then those companies will just pack their bags and go to another country which will offer them better facilities and low tax, right? So unfortunately, we live in this situation now where these companies are paying an incredibly low amount of taxes for the kind of profits and wealth that they're generating for their shareholders, and in particular those wealthy shareholders that are also sometimes sitting as managers or whatnot have you. So it's a difficult take, that one. And I'm not sure there is a correct or a wrong answer here. It's just a difficult situation where wealth has been amassed in the hands of a few, and those few are really controlling a lot of things that's happening, not just in terms of, business, but also in terms of public policy.
Omar, I love this conversation. It is so insightful. I love this, brother. And also, just I think governments have a role to play. For instance, I have seen at one point, I applied, I think, at Accenture, one of the consulting companies, and I saw their headquarters is actually in Ireland. So, like, Ireland is obviously cheaper in terms of taxes.
Yes.
So, for instance, there is Apple and all those companies. So, I feel that governments have a role to play, but also all those groups of countries, especially the European Union. I'm European, so I will just talk about the European Union. They have to regulate things, especially the European Union. They are always the first ones to regulate things. Sometimes even people blame them for over-regulating, but I feel that if it was not for them, there would be no regulation. So we need somebody to lead the pack. That was just my little comment on this. Coming back to the Muslim aspect of the show, how do you think on this very topic, how do you think Muslim countries where income inequality is a huge topic, do you feel that we should do something maybe a bit better? Obviously, it's a huge thing I'm asking you, but do you feel that there are some main topics that maybe we should focus on to progress as an ummah?
I think so. I mean, if you think about Islam in general, I mean, there's a strong element of social justice in the religion, right? It's certainly a principle, I think, in the faith to have social justice.
Yeah, zakat and everything.
Zakat and justice for the orphans, amongst other topics that are mentioned. So, if you look into the recent or even the past history actually of Islamic civilizations, rampant injustices have been some of the root causes behind the fall of empires, governments, and so on. So I think there's enough data and evidence that social ills such as inequalities are bad for the coherence of society. I would also argue theological argument here as well. And I think more needs to be done in Muslim majority countries, definitely. And I think this would also allow us to showcase perhaps a different social point of view to modern Western societies where inequalities are rampant. Unfortunately, inequalities are also rampant in the Muslim majority countries. So, how is it that we have come to this state where a core principle of our faith in terms of social justice is not being practiced? I think that's really something that we need to delve into. I'm not entirely sure how to do that because I think it requires many actors. Certainly, number one would be the governments and those people in power to think about these things. But I think it requires, a lot of thinking, brainstorming to think about how we can actually do this. And it would also be then a point of showing to the rest of the world the beauty of the religion and what we used to be, at least from a social point of view, from a societal point of view. I think we're missing a lot on that. Just going away then from the Muslim majority societies, but let's say in the West itself, there are many Muslim institutions that actually I think they are doing a lot of good work, certainly in terms of zakat. So some of the works in terms, for example, bank deliveries, distribution of zakat. If there are any non-Muslims who are listening to us, who would be listening to us. Zakat is probably the equivalent of what we would call a wealth tax, but Muslims generally have to pay once a year, or not once a year, but they have to pay throughout a year. Really, the work on that is incredible, and I'm personally interested in some long-term research actually with some of these zakat institutions in the UK in order to think about how to strategically try to fight poverty among Muslims, but also non-Muslims. And I also think there's a lot of work that maybe in the Zakat framework, but also beyond to fight, for example, youth unemployment. How do we teach people how to fish rather than just feed them the fish? I think there's a bit of work that's needed on these issues. So this is something that I'm definitely keen on working, and I think also it would show once again that Muslims can make a positive contribution in either the global picture or the local picture, however you want to look at it.
This is amazing. And actually, I think it's also a kind of dawah to do this. It's a kind of soft power because maybe the media are portraying a certain image that is not really realistic. And this is a way for us to step forward and to show what Islam is truly. And I think it's great. You're already the third brother Actually, the previous guest also mentioned this. So I feel it's something that the community really wants to do because I see it as a recurring topic and I love this.
One of the best forms of dawah is to be neighborly to your neighbor, right? And then the other form of dawah, probably, yeah, you're right, is to portray this caring image that Islam does have, is just somewhere, somehow, we seem to have lost our way.
I want to also address the youth here. You mentioned at some point in your research that you publish as a kind of portfolio. So excuse me of the term. So for instance, in tech, we have GitHub for us to publish our code. But here, for instance, in the research, I just knew ResearchGate before when I was in Germany. You mentioned another platform. Does it act like in tech when you say, hey, these are the things that I can bring in your company. This is what I've done. Is this such a thing for research? And can you tell us more about how to build credibility in your career in the field of research?
There's at least two ways that I know of anyway. The easiest way for people, I don't want to get too techy or technical about certain particular things that we do in the field, but Google Scholar tends to be the page, if you will, that lists all your publication. It calculates some kind of index as well to explain how much you publish, how well you've been cited, etc., etc. So Google Scholar, I think, would be the page that, for example, when you're getting promoted, sometimes a lot of institutions will give me the link to your Google Scholar page.
No way.
Yeah, because that would be the page that has everything. It picks up everything. It probably has some large language model behind the scene that picks up when you publish something, or you can tell it that you've published something if it doesn't show, and it'll pick it up.
It's so fascinating. I
Yeah.
never knew about this. It goes and search how many times, for instance, Omar, our brother was. This is amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But aren't you scared, because you mentioned LLM, aren't you scared that you work so hard on a research? Maybe it can take up to years to work on something. And at some point, like just an LLM will pick your stuff and somebody's just going to ask a prompt. And the response of this prompt is not going to mention Omar and all your other colleagues. Isn't it frustrating in a sense for you?
It depends. I wouldn't say so because remember, the point of research is to convey the message. So if the message is reaching without it having my name, I personally don't think that's a problem because the message has at least reached. Now, in an academic setting, or even if as a student you were to write an essay, you couldn't just go on ChatGPT or any other large language model and ask it to produce something without citing. You would need to cite in those contexts. So then you would get the citation if that is something that you care about. But generally speaking, no. I think the more widespread our research is, the better. In fact, a lot of academics, including myself, so for example, you publish an academic article in a certain journal, and it's very techy, uses very scientific academic jargon and everything that nobody's going to have the time to read. So a lot of us, what we do is we write a summarized piece, so what ChatGPT would probably do today, but we would also change it for a different audience. So that would go in like the conversation, it would go in a news or press release, or in something that the layman can pick up whenever he or she is going to work or something like this. So academics try to do that because, again, the point is to pass the message and get people to think and have that impact, if you will.
What do you think in this world of teaching is the hardest, for instance, in business school? A lot of students feel that they're going to acquire a lot of knowledge, but then when they go in the company, they feel they learn more at the corporate world than the actual school. How do you think like we can catch up in terms of school to adapt to the reality of the business world? Because it's not catching, I feel, and maybe the youth is feeling, as fast as the job market is.
That's an interesting question. I think in the UK anyway, I'm not sure for the rest of Europe whether this is the case, but there has been a heightened level of attack on universities, questioning certain degree courses, their relevance to the skills that are needed in the job market and so on. It's as if there is no connection, basically. That's the accusation. No connection between university education and what you actually need in the job. So obviously, I'm not here to give a blanket opinion on this question because it's quite provocative. But I'll share with you my opinion and my experience of working in this sector. My opinion is university education is not supposed to be so narrow that it only revolves around job market skills. I don't think that was ever the point. It is not the point and probably never will. Or rather, university education is supposed to be more wholesome. In particular, it's supposed to give the student the tools to be able to adapt to different job market roles, and even the job market is fluctuating today. Under some sort of training or supervision or development at the beginning, you always need some kind of a mentor at the beginning, but at least university education gives you the tools to be able to adapt to different roles in a certain job. One of the skills, for example, that I think we really care about is critical thinking. So the ability to question the overall validity of certain things, the ability to question certain assumptions that certain theories or certain people are making when they are taking decisions, digging really deep, evaluating alternative options, etc. So that's generally what we think of when we say critical thinking. And I really believe that university education offers that. Now, what is the advantage of this is if you have this tool, it doesn't matter what problem you're coming to in the world of work. You'll still be able to question those assumptions. You'll still be able to dig deeper because you've been equipped 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 4 years in order to develop and hone these skills properly. So I think university education, a lot of it is about that. Now, that being said, at the same time, there needs to be a link between the education that you're getting there and the job market. There's no doubt about that. For example, one of the things I teach is people analytics. And obviously, generally speaking, I'm in a bit of a particular situation here because I work in a business school. And by definition, therefore, I'm in a bit of a privileged position that, the courses we teach by default tend to be linked to something related to the job market or to something related to a certain job that somebody would do. So people analytics, for example, goes into data analysis, using data, collecting data, questioning how this data can be used for decision making, using tools such as machine learning, large language models, etc., etc. So within that course, there was a lot of job market skills that would probably allow you not just to work in people analytics, but to work in any other kind of form of data questioning or where data is required in order to process and in order to use it for decision making. So, I mean, I think that there needs to be a fine balance here between wanting something to be extremely narrow versus not having a link or connection at all to the job. I think the answer, and this is going to sound cliche, and I apologize for this, but the truth lies in between, if you will.
I wanted to ask also, you mentioned the business schools and the university side of things. Aside from one being more turned towards the job market, what differences would you say are the most significant between being an associate professor? I don't know if it's the job title they have in the university and being a professor in a business school. And in the future, are you looking forward to go in the university side of things, or are you happy with the business school?
So the business school is part of the university. It's just a department within the university generally.
Oh,
Now I think
okay.
in France it's a little bit different. Probably this is where you're thinking because there are certain business schools that are purely business schools, like HEC, for example.
Exactly.
I think ESSEC is the same.
Yeah, it's
If
my school.
right, if I'm not mistaken. So I think the biggest difference are the number of students, quite frankly. So in a business school, oh my gosh, the number of students we get for our courses are really massive. Because again, education is a return on investment. If it's not investment of money, then it's at least investment of time. And it seems that there is some kind of understanding, if you will, in society that a business school education would generate a positive return on investment more than probably some other courses. Now, I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but that seems to be the prevalent feeling,
Opinion.
your opinion in society, if you will. Yeah. So I think that's one of the biggest differences. We generally, in my opinion anyway, tend to have a lot more students than other departments in a university. And the teaching, there are certain perks and facilities that a business school offers. So I'll just leave it at that, probably.
I saw the campus of work just before the interview. I went on Google Images. I love to see university campuses, so I went to see, and actually, it's really pretty. Like it has a kind of lake and stuff. It's really. I think the atmosphere where you evolve as a student is really so important for your well-being. I wanted to ask also something. I have been a teacher before in English. Actually, I don't know if my English is that good. You will say. But what was very frustrating at that time, it's that there were huge differences sometimes of level. I wanted to dedicate time to certain students, but at the same time, I had to make the class progress. So it was kind of frustrating because I felt that even though I was trying, by focusing on the whole, I was kind of letting go of my mission of being a teacher because I didn't have the time I wanted to have with those particular students. So, do you see those differences in terms of level, and how do you tackle, for instance, this? I would be interested because at the time I was struggling with this.
That's an interesting question. It's a difficult one as well, really, because when you're a teacher or an instructor or university lecturer and you've prepared a course or a module, as we call them in the UK, over 9 weeks or 10 weeks or however long it might be, there are certain key objectives you want to achieve each week. And if anything is going to delay you in achieving a certain week's objectives, then that's going to have a domino effect on the rest of the course or the module. So you don't want that to happen generally because then you would be failing one of your main objectives. But however, you're absolutely right that in any class, typically the observation I have is you have 30% which are very good students. They're going to be getting the top marks. You've got a good 20-ish percent that are going to be struggling, and then the rest is in the middle. And generally speaking, those struggling ones, in my experience, they are the ones who should be taking advantage. Now, as instructors, we offer advantages such as office hours. So you open your office and you like, come in, ask me the questions you have, and I'll try to help you as much as I can. And if I can't, then there's somebody else, a different tutor or something, who might be able to pitch in and help you. Now, generally speaking, those students either they feel too shy or there is some kind of a blockage where they don't take advantage of these opportunities, generally is what I've seen. So I think one of the advice I would give to the students who are struggling is do take advantage, because if you don't go, nobody's going to come to you, right? The money and the advice is not going to come to you automatically. You need to go and search for it. But from the instructor side, probably that's one of the best things we can do is one-to-one office hours. And I've seen in the past that some students who would have been struggling because of this one-to-one, maybe something wasn't clear in their head, or just one thing was blocking them from understanding something, and then they come and they're like, ah, now I get it. Because sometimes you can give an example that just enlightens the student and opens a door to thinking that otherwise wouldn't have happened, right? So anything can happen. That's the way I would deal with it.
I had a statistics actually to give to the audience. Research shows that mentorship can increase career satisfaction by 80%, but only 30% of minorities report having access to a mentor. How do you think you could advise our community where people are really struggling? Now it's evolving, especially in the big four consulting companies where they have powerful Muslim networks already in place, but some people may be in areas which are more secluded. How do I get to find someone like that I can look up for advice?
Very recently, part of my consulting arm, I worked on something that we call the Birmingham Pakistani Report. So people can Google that, Birmingham Pakistani Report. So Birmingham is the second largest city in the UK, and 17% of Birmingham's population is of a Pakistani ethnicity, which is quite massive. And the point of the report was to actually assess and question the livelihood, the lifestyle, the desires, the wants, the lacuna, if you will, in the Pakistani community in Birmingham. And one of them, as you correctly mentioned, was this kind of lack of mentoring. And what we see in the data until now, and the work that I'm doing, there's another organization called BRIG, the Birmingham Race Inequality Group. So we're working on a report and we're analyzing data. And what we're seeing is actually the youth from minorities, as you said, they tend to have a very high level of education. However, when it comes to getting the top post or the better jobs, which are accompanied by the higher salaries and the higher wages, they don't necessarily, there is a disconnect between the education and the earnings. Far more of a disconnect in minorities than it would be for the majority population. And I think to me, when I look at the data, and again, we don't have anything to kind of explain, we have to sort of surmise of why this could be the case. Of course, one of the reasons could be discrimination outright, which is difficult to prove or anything like this. But the other reason, in my opinion, is mentorship and this all lack of networking, which are kind of, I think, related to each other. And that's really some of the things that we thought of looking at. In the Birmingham Pakistani report, the youth did say that they did not know who could be good mentors for them. And I think that's one of the things that we need to correct, especially in the minority communities across Europe or anywhere else. We need to find good mentors for the youth, especially because there's a high degree of youth unemployment that we are seeing in these societies and other societies as well. So I think people should give their time. People who are professionals, I'm talking to myself, but also others who are older, who've made it, who can offer some help. I know, like for example, in the UK, many doctors, as far as I know anyway, offer their help to others when somebody wants to study medicine. How do I do it? How do I do well on the interview, etc., etc. Doctors help, and I think they have a very good network. Certainly in the UK, I think in other professions as well, just like you mentioned in the consulting arms. But I think there is a general lack otherwise of good mentors and good mentorship, in particular because, and I think before the podcast we kind of spoke about this, is you might be born in a certain arrondissement of Paris, which is not very high class, or where, let's say, the standard of living is not as high as other arrondissements in Paris. Similarly, in Birmingham, a big city, you could be in certain electoral wards, which generally tend to not be very prosperous, economically speaking, anyway. To get these people, maybe these people want to step out, see the broader picture, the bigger world, be able to have a higher education, be able to, again, get the best jobs with the best income and everything. I really think you need mentors in order to do that. And I think people should give up some of their time, some advice, just to be able to coach and mentor younger people, because I think we have to give back in some shape or form, and I think we're really lacking in terms of having good mentors in the Muslim communities. And or at least I think we have good mentors. There's at least two problems then. If the mentors are there, is that they are not reaching out to potential mentees, or the other way around, the mentees do not know and reach out to the mentors. There's also an age and generational divide. I think we need to find ways of bridging these gaps. Something needs to be done for younger people, in my opinion.
This topic is so interesting because there are so many themes inside of it. For instance, in Paris, it's the transportation project where they're trying to build what we call the Grand Paris. The Paris network system is already one of the biggest in the world, but they're going to expand it so that the people in the suburbs can go in Paris really quickly, and where they were secluded before, they will have access to entertainment, education, job opportunities, so much more. So there are so many ways to tackle this. Mentorship can be one, transportation, and so many others. But one thing I really want us to focus on, and I'm so glad Umar brought the Birmingham report in this conversation. I'm from a ghetto, a very poor ghetto. I'm very proud of it. It's one thing to sit on a bench and say, hey, there are not enough opportunities because I'm brown, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. But then, and some part of it is true. And some part of it, well, first you got to do something about it. For instance, this Pakistani guy from Birmingham, he said, I'm going to gather qualitative data, quantitative data, so that I can get the most solid report that I can present to the political bodies, organization, that can then lobby accordingly and tell, hey, I want to advocate for these people because there are some facts, some research behind this. So I just want the audience to get inspired on this, and I will put the report in the description. It's a very easy read, so I would love for the audience, especially the French, to get inspired by this initiative. I don't know if you have a closing thing to say, Omar.
No, but I mean, I think in France, obviously, it would probably behoove us to do a similar report, probably for the people from the Maghreb, right? So,
Yeah.
because I think there's a lot of pent up inequalities and suburbs which have been, left to die or left to themselves in Paris and beyond Paris as well. I think it would be great to see a report on similar things, it would also be great to see, as I said before, us as Muslims getting together and making dawah, but in a subtle way, right? So in terms
Exactly.
of the neighborly activities and whatnot have you.
Brother, I wanted this conversation to be the one of two friends in a cafe, and this turned out to be exactly this. Jazakallah khairan for this conversation. I'm so grateful because we touched on so many topics and you are so insightful. Thank you so much, my brother.
Well, Yakum, and thank you again for having me. We could have talked on a lot of things about what I
Yeah.
do, but I think people have limited time, and I also think feel free to Google me, to reach out to me. Always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. If this is of any help to anyone, more than happy to help in any way.
I will leave all relevant links in the description, including Omar's LinkedIn and the Birmingham report and any other relevant links. Thank you so much, my brother, and assalamu alaikum. Allah Hafiz.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.